There's a special kind of arrogance that mistakes simplicity for weakness. My son-in-law Brad wore it at a dinner party last fall, holding up my worn leather shoe for the whole table to see. He called my life small, told my daughter she'd married beneath her potential. Then he bragged about his promotion to senior director at a logistics firm, clapped me on the back, and said, "You wouldn't understand real work, Walter." He didn't know I'd founded that company from a garage 40 years ago, and that the holding company that signs every one of his paychecks is mine. My name is Walter Whitlock. In Beckley, West Virginia, I'm the old widower with a rusted truck and prize-winning tomatoes. But 41 years ago, I built a logistics company from a garage, hiding my ownership behind a holding company that now signs every paycheck Brad Wilson has cashed. My daughter Lila married him, and he mistook my simplicity for failure. Last fall, at a dinner party, he held up my worn shoe and laughed. He didn't know I could end his career with one phone call. The real story isn't about my revenge. It's about what a man discovers when he humiliates the wrong quiet man, and that the truth always comes wearing old leather. Let me take you back to before the shoe, before the dinner table, before Brad Wilson ever learned my first name. 41 years ago, I was a 26-year-old with a high school diploma, a dead wife's memory, and a rusted toolbox. My Martha died when Lila was 3 months old. I had nothing left but that baby and a stubborn refusal to fail her. I started Whitlock Logistics in my brother-in-law's garage with a single forklift and a promise I whispered to myself every night, "This company will outlive every doubt they ever laid on me." By 1995, Whitlock was moving freight across 6 states. By 2000, we had a fleet of 200 trucks and a reputation for never missing a deadline. But I never put my name on the building. I never gave interviews. I let a holding company, WH Holdings, own the shares and a professional board, run the public face. Why? Because I learned early that a quiet man can see the whole board game, while loud men are still arguing over the pieces. And because I never wanted Leela to grow up under the shadow of someone else's expectations. I wanted her to know the man who watered tomatoes, not the man who could buy the block. Leela inherited her mother's laugh and my distrust of flashy things. She became a high school teacher, fell in love with the work, and for a long time, the two of us were enough. Then she met Brad Wilson at a charity gala I'd skipped on purpose. He was 28, sharp-jawed, with the kind of handshake that lingers 2 seconds too long. He worked at a mid-sized competitor, had a business degree, and a smile that told you he was already calculating his next step. Leela was smitten. I wanted to be happy for her, but my gut said, "This man has been practicing his own eulogy in the mirror." Still, I vetted him. I quietly put him through the same background process we use for senior hires. His numbers came back solid. He was ambitious, maybe too much, but not a crook. When Leela said she was serious, I made a decision. I nudged the board to acquire Brad's firm, fold it into Whitlock, and offer him a management track position. He never knew. He thought he'd been headhunted based on pure merit, which, to give him his due, he mostly had. I just handed him the door. Leela knew, of course. She called me a menace with a grandfather's grin. I told her every father needs a hobby. For 2 years, Brad climbed. He became director of regional sales, then senior director of operations. His salary tripled. He bought a house with granite countertops and a wine fridge that whispered affirmations when you opened it. He started wearing shoes that cost more than my first truck. And with every promotion, the humility I'd glimpsed early on shrank a little more. He began to talk about his vision at family barbecues. He would explain logistics to me, carefully. The way you explain a smartphone to someone who still owns a flip. I just nodded. I had 87 people who reported to him, and every one of them was on my payroll. He had no idea. Leela saw it. She'd call me after dinner parties and say, "Dad, he's becoming his own press release." I told her marriage was a long game, and people grow into the selves they think they deserve. I didn't tell her I had a file on his internal performance metrics, or that his last quarterly report overstated his division's efficiency by crediting work done by a junior team he'd never even met. I didn't tell her I'd already decided to wait. Because a man who's self-correcting doesn't need a firing. He needs a mirror. And I was about to become one. The dinner party was in late September. Brad and Leela hosted 12 guests at their home to celebrate Brad's latest promotion, a regional vice presidency that wasn't real yet, but he'd been promised. I showed up in my usual clean jeans, an old flannel shirt, and my leather work boots that had walked through 3 decades and never once complained. The moment I stepped in, I felt the temperature shift. Brad's colleagues eyed my boots, my truck parked out front, and filed me under quaint. I let them. We drank wine. We made small talk. Leela cooked a roast that should have won a medal. And then, around 8:30, after Brad had emptied half a bottle of Cabernet, he stood up. He tapped his glass with a fork. He announced to the room that he wanted to offer a toast to family, ambition, and to the lesson that anyone can rise if they work hard enough. Then he looked at me. His smile had that shine, the one that isn't light but reflection. "Take my father-in-law here," he said, gesturing at my boots. Leela's dad. A simple man. He's never known real work, never built anything, never had a corner office, and yet, here he is, enjoying the life I've built for his daughter. He laughed, picked up my foot from under the table, and held my worn shoe up like a museum artifact. "These," he said, "are the shoes of a man who's settled for small. Leela, honey, you married up. Way up." The room laughed, uncomfortably, but they laughed. Leela's face went pale. I looked at that shoe. I looked at him, and for a full 10 seconds, I said nothing. I want you to understand why I stayed silent. Not because I was weak. Because I had spent a lifetime watching men like Brad self-destruct with just enough rope. And because in that moment, I knew something he didn't. An internal audit had been quietly scheduled at Whitlock Logistics, driven by an anomaly I'd spotted 3 weeks earlier. His division's numbers didn't add up. The junior team's database showed productivity spikes he'd claimed for himself. The audit would expose him. And the board meeting that followed would require the silent owner, me, to attend. So I let the silence stretch like a blade. A week later, Brad called me in a panic. He'd received an email from WH Holdings, a full financial review of regional operations, mandatory restructuring. His job, his title, his entire department were suddenly under a microscope. He was terrified. He told me, "You wouldn't understand, Walter, but this could end me." I told him I hoped it would work out. I hung up, and I watered my tomatoes. The man who had laughed at my shoes had no idea he was about to sit across a boardroom table from the same worn leather, and that the man wearing them would decide his future. The weeks that followed would strip him down to something he'd never allowed anyone to see: the truth. The audit began on a Tuesday morning without warning. I'd triggered it personally, a single encrypted memo sent from WH Holdings to the independent compliance firm we kept on retainer. They arrived at Brad's regional office at 8 a.m., opened server logs, pulled client correspondence, and started cross-referencing performance claims against actual digital timestamps. Brad called me at noon, voice tight. "Walter, something's happening here." Some kind of surprise review. They're in my files. I was in my garden, tying tomato vines. I said, "Well, son, big companies do that. Probably routine." He made a sound halfway between a laugh and a choke. Routine? They're pulling emails from 14 months ago. Walter, you don't understand corporate pressure. I told him to keep his head down, cooperate, and trust the process. He hung up without saying goodbye. By Thursday, the auditors had a preliminary report. It was 71 pages long and sat in my inbox before sunrise. I read it with black coffee and the quiet satisfaction of a man who has already done the math. The junior logistics optimization team, led by a 29-year-old woman named Sonia Reyes, had developed a routing algorithm that saved the company $2.7 million in fuel and overtime between January and September. Brad had presented that work to the executive board as his own. Not indirectly. Not with shared credit. He used the words "my initiative" 7 times in one slide deck. He had signed off on a project summary that listed himself as the sole architect. Sonia and her team were mentioned in the fine print as support staff. The report included time-stamped design files showing the algorithm's original creation dates, all predating Brad's involvement by 5 months. Sonia's manager had tried to flag the discrepancy. Brad overrode him and noted that leadership meant owning outcomes. That evening, Leela called me. She was crying. Brad had come home, poured a scotch without speaking, and then snapped at her when she asked about his day. He told her someone was trying to sabotage his career. He said it might be her simple father spreading rumors. He actually said that. Leela, God bless her, said, "Dad, he's unraveling. What is happening?" I told her some things in life unravel so they can be rewoven correctly. She said I was infuriatingly cryptic. I told her I loved her, and I meant it with every cell in my body. The call that changed everything came on Friday night. Brad's voice had lost its polish. It was raw, the voice of a man who has been awake too long and has stopped pretending he's in control. "They're calling an emergency board meeting," he said. "Next Thursday. All senior directors have to present their department results. Walter, the owner, is attending." He whispered the word owner like it was a mythical creature he'd been assured didn't exist. Everyone at Whitlock knew someone owned the company. Nobody knew who. For 2 decades, the silent owner had been a legend, an invisible man who signed papers through a holding trust and never appeared. Some guessed he was a foreign consortium. Others thought he was dead. Brad had once joked at a dinner party that the owner was probably just a tax loophole. "He's the Wizard of Oz," Brad said. "Nobody actually meets him." I smiled at that memory, holding the phone. "I've never presented to the owner," Brad said. "Nobody has. Walter, if this audit is bad, he could fire me on the spot." I asked him what the auditors had shown him so far. He hemmed. He said there were some attribution issues that were misunderstandings. He said he'd been delegating too much, and the team had taken credit for his strategic direction. He said, "You wouldn't get it, Walter. This is high-level stuff." I let that settle in the silence. Do you know how much power there is in silence? A man who is lying will always fill it. Brad filled it with justifications, rationalizations, and finally, a small, honest crack. "I might have overreached," he said. "Maybe, just a little." I told him Thursday would come, and the truth would set the table. He didn't know how literal that was. Over the weekend, I reviewed the full history of Brad's employment. Not just the performance reports, but his personnel file, his internal communications, the anonymous feedback from his direct reports. 19 out of 32 employees had given him negative marks on leadership. Words like credit hoarder, absent in crisis, and rehearsed came up. Yet he had consistently been promoted because he was excellent at presenting other people's work. His PowerPoints were immaculate. His smile was boardroom ready. He was a man built for the performance of success, not the substance. And here's the thing that kept me awake Saturday night. I had known. I had seen the reports, and I had let him rise because he was my daughter's husband, and because I believed people could grow into their roles. But now, his growth was a fraud, and the bill was due. Monday morning, I called the board chairman, a loyal man named Gerald Pike, who had guarded my anonymity with the ferocity of a Doberman. I told him the plan. I would attend Thursday's meeting in person, unannounced until the moment Brad began his presentation. I would sit at the head of the table. Gerald would introduce me only after Brad had finished speaking. Gerald, who had seen everything in 40 years of corporate warfare, said, "He's going to have a stroke, Walter." I said, "I'd prefer he had a career epiphany, but a stroke is his choice." Gerald chuckled grimly and said he'd have the boardroom cameras angled for the full reaction. Tuesday, I pulled my old truck into the dealership and had the cracked mirror replaced. Not for vanity, but because when I drove to that boardroom, I wanted every detail to be deliberate. I polished my worn boots myself, sitting on the front steps. The same boots Brad had held up as a joke. I thought about Martha, about the years when those boots walked through warehouses at 3 in the morning, because a shipment was stuck and the night crew needed a second hand. Those boots had stood in snow, in diesel spills, on the concrete floor of a garage where I once sat alone, holding a baby girl and whispering that we would survive. Brad Wilson had held them up and called them small. He didn't know that the soles of those shoes had pressed down on a path he was only allowed to walk because I had built it. Wednesday evening, Leela came over. She sat at my kitchen counter with chamomile tea, just like she had 100 times. She said, "Dad, Brad's barely sleeping. He's scared. He keeps saying the owner will destroy him." "Do you know who it is?" I looked at my daughter. Her eyes were her mother's, which meant they could see me in ways I couldn't hide. I said, "Leela, I need you to trust me tomorrow. Whatever happens, it's been building for 2 years. And your husband has a chance to become the man you deserve." She didn't flinch. She said, "You're the owner, aren't you?" I said nothing. She shook her head slowly, a small smile breaking through the worry. "I always knew you were impossible," she said. "I didn't know you were this impossible." I told her the flannel was a lifestyle choice, not a strategy. She hugged me, and for a moment, I was just a father, not an owner. Thursday morning. The boardroom was on the top floor of Whitlock's headquarters in Charleston, a glass tower that had my name nowhere on it. I parked 3 blocks away, walked slowly in the crisp autumn air, boots clicking on the sidewalk. I arrived 40 minutes early and used a private elevator that nobody but Gerald and the building engineer knew about. It opened directly into the coat room behind the boardroom. I could hear the early arrivals, the clink of coffee cups, the murmur of nervous senior directors who knew the owner would be there but didn't know his face. Brad's voice cut through. He was rehearsing, running through his presentation with forced confidence. He said to a colleague, "The owner's just a figurehead, probably some investor who wants hand-holding. I'll handle it." The arrogant certainty of a man standing on sand. The boardroom filled. I waited until Gerald rapped the table and called the meeting to order. He said the agenda would commence with regional operating reviews, beginning with Senior Director Wilson. I heard Brad stand, clear his throat, and launch into his presentation. I listened from the coat room. He was smooth, emphasizing strategic oversight, crediting my team for the routing project without ever mentioning Sonia Reyes by name. He said, "Under my leadership, we achieved a 17% efficiency gain. 17%. The real number was 23, and it belonged to a junior analyst who was now sitting in the back of the room, afraid to meet anyone's eyes. Brad finished his summary, and the room gave polite, uncertain taps on the table. Then Gerald spoke. "Thank you, Mr. Wilson. Before we continue, I want to introduce someone. As you all know, WH Holdings has maintained a confidential ownership structure for over 2 decades. The founder and sole owner is here with us today." I heard chairs shift, cloth rustle, the collective intake of breath that fills a room when a ghost is about to become flesh. I opened the courtroom door and walked into the light. The boardroom was long and polished, the table a dark mahogany runway. 22 faces turned. I walked to the head of the table, the seat that had been left conspicuously empty, and I sat down. I was wearing my clean flannel shirt, my worn jeans, and the boots Brad had mocked. I folded my hands on the table and looked directly at my son-in-law. Brad Wilson was still standing, his PowerPoint frozen behind him. A slide highlighting Brad Wilson, Division Impact in bold white letters. His face did something I have only seen in men who have just recognized that the floor they've been walking on was glass all along. His mouth opened. Nothing came out. The room was so silent I could hear the ventilation hum. Then I spoke. "Mr. Wilson," I said, "that was a very interesting presentation. Let's go through it again. Line by line. Starting with the routing optimization project. I'd like you to tell me exactly which parts you built with your own hands." Brad's world was about to crack open, and every person in that room knew it. The truth had arrived, and it was wearing old leather. Brad stood frozen, the clicker dangling from his fingers, the screen behind him still glowing with his face next to the words "Impact." He was a man who had built an entire career on being able to speak through any silence, and now his mouth moved without producing sound, like a fish pulled onto unfamiliar air. I didn't rush him. The boardroom was full of people who had never seen a senior director speechless, and I wanted them all to remember the exact weight of the pause. Gerald Pike sat to my right, his expression the practiced neutrality of a man who had known this moment was coming for weeks. The other directors exchanged glances, their notepads forgotten, the usual bureaucratic hum replaced by the hollow whine of the air conditioning. I repeated the question, softer this time. "Tell me, Brad, which pieces of the routing optimization were yours?" He finally found his voice, but it wasn't the one he used in presentations. It was thinner, defensive, the voice of someone reaching for a life raft that had already floated away. "I supervised the team," he said. "Leadership is about orchestrating talent. The vision was mine, the strategic direction." I let the words hang there for a moment. Then I opened the leather folder Gerald had placed in front of me and removed the first page of the preliminary audit. "Vision," I said, reading from the summary. "The algorithm's original architecture was drafted by Sonia Reyes on March 12th, 4 months before you were briefed on the project. She presented initial findings to your predecessor, who was transferred before you arrived. You inherited an active initiative, rebranded it as your own, and removed her name from the authorship metadata. Do I have that correct?" Brad's jaw tightened, the tell of a man who had been caught not by a lie detector, but by something far more precise, a paper trail. "I refined it," he said. "I brought it to the board. That's what leaders do. They take raw work and make it sellable. Frankly, without my presentation, that project would have died in middle management." That word, frankly, came out with such rehearsed indignation that I almost smiled. I looked past him, toward the back of the room, where Sonia Reyes was sitting stiffly in a chair against the wall. She was a small woman with dark eyes, and the quiet intensity of someone who had been told her entire career that good work speaks for itself and had learned, painfully, that it doesn't. "Miss Reyes," I said, "would you stand up, please?" She did, uncertain, her hands clasped in front of her. "Miss Reyes is a junior analyst. She has never presented to this board. She doesn't have an expense account or a reserved parking space. But she wrote the code that saved this company $2.7 million. Is that right, Brad?" Brad didn't turn around to look at her. His eyes stayed fixed on me, and I watched him calculate, in real time, whether he could still spin his way out of this. "I didn't know the specifics of her contribution," he said. "My understanding was that the team operated under my direction. If credit was misattributed, that's an administrative oversight." I let out a small breath, the kind that in my house would have preceded a long talk with Leela about the difference between a mistake and a choice. "Administrative oversight," I repeated. I reached into the folder again and pulled out a printed email chain. "This is from June 18th. Your direct subordinate, Arthur Chen, wrote to you expressing concern that Sonia's work was being subsumed into your personal performance review. You replied the same day. I'll read your words. The narrative is more important than the granular details. My name on this opens doors for the whole division. Sonia will benefit from the reflected success." I looked up at him. The room was utterly still. "She didn't benefit, Brad. She watched her algorithm, her months of labor, get paraded before this board with your face on it. She sat in the back and said nothing, because she has bills to pay and a career to protect, and because she doesn't have a father-in-law who owns the company." That last phrase cut through the room like a scalpel. Several directors visibly flinched. One of the senior legal counsels adjusted her glasses and stared at Brad with the special contempt reserved for people who have made the entire institution look bad. Brad's complexion had gone from confident tan to an uneven blotchy red. He was still standing, but his posture had collapsed inward, as if his spine was trying to retreat from the room. "This is a setup," he said quietly, almost to himself. Then louder, "You've been planning this. You put me in this position just to humiliate me in front of—" He stopped, maybe realizing that finishing that sentence would require him to say aloud that he had been humiliating me for months without realizing who I was. "I put you in this position because you married my daughter," I said, my voice level, "because I believed, against every instinct I've honed over 4 decades, that love might teach you what mentoring couldn't. I gave you a door. You walked through it and then pretended you had built the entire hallway." I turned to the board. For the record, I did not engineer Mr. Wilson's promotion path. I approved his original hiring. Yes, but his subsequent advances were based on performance metrics that he himself reported. Metrics that, according to this audit, are inflated by a margin of at least 40%. I gestured toward Gerald, who handed out the summary pages down the table. The directors began flipping through them, their faces cycling from curiosity to alarm. "He's been claiming team-level results as personal wins for 18 months, I continued. "He's blocked internal transfer requests from junior staff who tried to move to departments where credit is shared more fairly. He's overridden performance reviews to suppress complaints about his management style. And he did all of this while telling his family, my family, that he was the architect of a turnaround that belonged to a team of 23 people who are currently burned out and quietly looking for other jobs." Brad's head came up at that last part. The mention of family. He was thinking, I knew, of Leela, of the fact that I was Leela's father, and that Leela was a majority shareholder, and that the power structure of his entire life had just inverted. "Does Leela know?" he asked, and the question came out with a kind of desperate hope, as if maybe this was just an elaborate father-in-law prank that would end with a handshake and a bottle of wine. My daughter, I said, has known who I was since she was old enough to understand a balance sheet. What she didn't know was the depth of your deception, because I shielded her from it while I waited to see whether you would correct course on your own. You didn't. I paused, letting the weight of that settle. She knows now. She knew this morning. She's at home, waiting to hear whether her husband is the man she thought she married, or a stranger who borrowed a life from people too junior to fight back. A director named Vance, a gray-haired operations veteran who had been with Whitlock since the early days, cleared his throat. "Walter, if I may, what's the financial exposure?" I nodded at him, grateful for the pivot toward cold numbers, because cold numbers are what boardrooms understand. The $2.7 million from the routing project is only part of it. Because Mr. Wilson's division claimed a 17% gain on the back of that algorithm, we recalibrated our quarterly projections and issued elevated earnings guidance. If the real gain was lower, which it was, we've been overstating efficiency to shareholders for 2 quarters. The auditors estimate a potential restatement exposure in the range of $8 to $11 million, depending on how the SEC views it when they get the corrected filings. The room inhaled collectively. Shareholder liability was the language everyone spoke. Brad Wilson had just become a risk factor in a financial disclosure, not just a senior director who got caught padding his URSAM. The escalation was complete. What had started as a dinner party slight had mushroomed into a regulatory and fiduciary crisis. All because a man couldn't bear to share a spotlight. Brad's legs seemed to weaken. He put a hand on the edge of the table to steady himself. The slide behind him was still up, the bold white letters now looking less like a celebration and more like a criminal charge. "I can fix this," he said. "I'll make it right. I'll personally apologize to Sonia, to the team. I'll restructure the division. I held up a hand. The question isn't whether you can fix the spreadsheets. The question is whether you can fix the part of you that thought this was acceptable in the first place. Because that part, Brad, that part is the reason you're standing there right now and not sitting here with the rest of us as a trusted executive." I removed one last sheet from the folder. It was a printed copy of a text message, a fragment I had asked Gerald to retrieve from the company phone records. "On the evening of the dinner party, after you held up my shoe and called my life small, you sent a message to your college friend Mark Keller. I'll read it. Dude, my father-in-law is so clueless. I literally own his whole world, and he has no idea. Free real estate." The room flinched again. I folded the page and set it aside. "I didn't need that message to understand your character, but I think it helps everyone here understand exactly what kind of man you've been operating as." Brad had no response. His eyes were wet, but it was the wetness of humiliation, not remorse. There is a difference. I've learned it over a lifetime of watching men face consequences they never believed would land on them. Remorse is quiet, turned inward. Humiliation is loud, even when it's silent, because it's still about the self. I was not yet convinced that the man across the table had the capacity for the first. I leaned forward, folding my hands on the table, the same worn leather of my boots tucked under the chair, out of sight but present. "So here's where we are," I said. "You have defrauded this company of credit, endangered our financial reporting, and lied to your wife about the substance of your career. The simplest outcome would be for me to terminate your employment immediately, refer the matter to our legal team for potential civil recovery, and let the personal chips fall where they may. But I've lived long enough to know that the simplest outcome is not always the right one, especially when family is involved." I paused, scanning the room, then returned my gaze to him. So I'm going to offer you a choice. The only thing that can't be chosen is the easy path. That one closed the moment you decided another person's work belonged to you. The boardroom held its breath. Somewhere down the hallway, a phone rang twice and went silent. The air felt thin, the way it does before a storm finally breaks. Brad Wilson looked at me, and then at his shoes, which were expensive and polished and completely useless for the road ahead. And I leaned back, waiting, because the most important part of this story hadn't happened yet. The most important part was what he would say next. The silence lasted 23 seconds. I counted. Brad Wilson's hand was still pressed flat on the mahogany table, knuckles drained of color, his eyes moving between the printed text message and my face. He was searching for an exit that didn't exist. The other directors didn't move. Some of them had stopped breathing. I stayed exactly where I was, hands folded, waiting, because I had learned decades ago that the moment after a man's armor cracks is the only moment he's capable of telling the actual truth. I was terrified, Brad said finally. His voice was raw, stripped of the boardroom polish, and it surprised me. Not the words, the tone. It was the first honest thing I'd heard from him in 2 years. I walked into this company and saw people who were smarter than me, more experienced, with degrees I couldn't afford, and I thought if I didn't claim every win that passed through my desk, I'd be exposed as a fraud. He swallowed hard. So I started borrowing. First a small idea, then a whole project. Sonia's work was brilliant. I told myself I was protecting it by giving it a louder voice. I told myself the credit didn't matter as long as the outcome was good. He finally looked away from me, toward Sonia, who was still standing in the back of the room. I was wrong. Sonia said nothing. Her face was unreadable, but her hands had stopped clutching each other. She looked at Brad the way a scientist might look at a specimen that had finally stopped pretending to be something else. You were wrong, I agreed. But terror isn't the same as malice, and recognizing a wrong is the first step, not the last. So here's your choice. I leaned forward, planting my elbows on the table. Option 1. You resign. Effective immediately. With no severance, no letter of recommendation, and no attempt to hide the truth from any future employer who calls our human resources department. You go home to my daughter, you tell her exactly what you did, and you spend however long it takes rebuilding your character from the ground up. Without my company, without my money, without the title you never earned. Brad's throat moved. His jaw tightened. But he nodded. And option 2? Option 2 is harder. You do not resign. Instead, you accept an immediate demotion to Junior Logistics Analyst, Level 1. The exact title Sonia Reyes held when she built the algorithm you stole. You will report directly to a newly appointed Director of Innovation, who will be Sonia herself. She will oversee your work, approve every document with your name on it, and submit quarterly character evaluations to my desk. Additionally, you will personally issue a written correction to every client, board member, and department head who received your misleading presentation, acknowledging your misattribution and giving full credit to Sonia and the team. You will also apologize to every junior employee whose career you blocked, face to face, with no filters, no spin. If you complete 1 calendar year under these terms without a single ethical violation, your employment will be reviewed for continued tenure at entry level. If you fail, you're out permanently, and option 1's silence agreement is revoked. You'll be fired with cause, and I'll let the industry draw its own conclusions. The boardroom stirred. Vance raised his eyebrows. Gerald Pike gave a slow, nearly invisible nod. This was not the clean execution they had expected. This was messy, personal, and deliberately humbling. But I wasn't running a firing squad. I was running a man through the same furnace I'd walked through 41 years ago. When I had nothing but a dead wife, a baby daughter, and a choice to become someone worth the loss I'd suffered. Brad closed his eyes. I watched him do the math, weighing his pride against the absolute certainty that option one would end his marriage and his career in a single afternoon. When he opened his eyes again, they were wet, but the set of his shoulders had changed. "I'll take option two," he said quietly. "I'll do what Sonia tells me. I'll earn it." He turned around fully to face Sonia Reyes. In front of 22 executives, he said, "Sonia, I'm sorry. I stole your work. I'll spend as long as you need undoing that damage." Sonia looked at me, then at Brad, then at the slide still glowing behind him. She didn't smile. She didn't cry. She gave a single, professional nod, the nod of a woman who had just been handed something long overdue, and said, "I'll send you the onboarding documents tomorrow." The board exhaled. Gerald Pike adjourned the meeting with a tap of his gavel. Chairs scraped. Jackets were buttoned. The directors filed out past Sonia, several of them shaking her hand for the first time, offering congratulations she should have received months ago. I stayed seated until the room emptied, leaving only Brad and me under the hum of the fluorescent lights. He sagged into a chair. Not my chair, the one he'd been standing beside. "I don't know how to face Leela," he said. "She's going to leave me." I regarded him for a long moment. The man in front of me was smaller than the one who had held up my shoe, and yet, strangely, more solid. "Leela knows the truth now. She's known since this morning. She's still at home, Brad. That should tell you something." He looked up at me, a fragile hope flickering. "She didn't leave?" "Not yet. But she won't stay for a title. She'll stay for a man who can do what you just did, admit the truth in public, accept the cost, and not make a single excuse. The question you have to answer tonight isn't whether she'll forgive you. It's whether you can become the version of yourself you just promised to be. Real life doesn't have boardroom witnesses. It has quiet mornings and hard years, and a woman who remembers your words at a dinner party." He nodded, head bowed. I stood, pushed in my chair, and walked toward the private elevator without looking back. I drove home in my old truck, the new mirror catching the sunset. The streets of Beckley were quiet, the kind of quiet that fills the space between moments that change everything. My phone buzzed. It was Leela. "Is it done?" she asked. "It started," I said. He chose the hard road. There was a pause, the kind of pause my daughter uses when she's deciding whether to scold me or thank me. "You're still impossible," she said, "and I still love you." Brad called me. He didn't spin it. I think he actually cried. I pulled into my driveway, killed the engine, and sat there a moment. "Crying isn't character," I said, "but the truth is a decent foundation." "How do you feel?" Another pause. Tired, hopeful, scared, like I'm married to a stranger who might actually become someone I haven't met yet. "That's not nothing," I said. "No, it isn't," she agreed. "I'll talk to you tomorrow, Dad. Wear clean socks at least." I smiled at the phone. The socks are non-negotiable. I got out of the truck and walked toward the house, but instead of going inside, I sat on the front steps, my back against the porch pillar, and I looked at my boots. The leather was cracked along the toe box, the soles worn thin in the ball of the foot. They were the last gift Martha ever gave me. She'd bought them with a teacher's discount card in the autumn of 1980, three weeks before her diagnosis, and she'd handed them to me with a laugh. "You'll walk through anything in these," she said. "And you'll look like a man who means it." She'd never seen the company, never tasted the success, never met the grandson who would one day call me Pop. But these boots had walked me through her funeral, through every warehouse floor I'd slept on in those early years, through the day I signed the holding trust that secured Lila's future while wearing a borrowed tie. Brad Wilson had held them up as a symbol of smallness, but he had no idea he was holding the last tangible piece of a woman who built more with a smile than he'd ever built with a stolen algorithm. I sat there until the porch light clicked on, until the crickets started their evening drone, until the dinner party, the boardroom, the entire 3-month arc of humiliation and reckoning settled into a quiet, durable peace. The real revenge wasn't the look on Brad's face. It wasn't the boardroom reveal, or the promotion I handed Sonia, or the demotion I handed my own son-in-law. The real revenge was the fact that after all of it, I was still the same man I'd been before he ever learned my name. Still wearing the same boots, still watering the same tomatoes, still sitting on the same porch where Lila used to do homework in the summer heat. Empires rise and fall, men posture and lose. But a quiet man who knows exactly what he built and exactly who he is, that man doesn't need to win. He's already won the moment the fight starts. Somewhere across town, Brad Wilson was sitting down across from my daughter, preparing to explain the full architecture of his deceit, and I was not afraid for her. Because the daughter of Martha Whitlock, the daughter of a woman who chose those boots and that man, had inherited more than money. She had inherited the spine to see through a lie, and the heart to forgive a man who genuinely wanted to change. What happened next was up to them. There's a quiet army of men and women like Walter Whitlock. They drive old trucks, wear faded shirts, and sit in the back rows of boardrooms where their names aren't on the door. They built the things we rely on, and they did it without applause. The world trains us to look past them, to mistake simplicity for insignificance and humility for failure. But here's the quiet truth that a worn pair of boots can teach you. The people who need the loudest introductions are often the ones who've earned the least. The ones who can sit in silence, content with who they are the ones who hold the deeds. I think about Walter on his porch, the porch Martha never saw, the one built with money earned in warehouses she never walked through. I think about those boots, the last gift from a woman who never doubted that the quiet man she married would become something steady. She was right. And the boots outlasted the company's quarterly reports, the promotions, the dinner parties, even the son-in-law's arrogance. They'll probably outlast all of us. That's the thing about things built to last. They don't need to shout. Brad Wilson's story isn't finished. He's sitting across from Leela right now, trying to explain himself, trying to become someone who doesn't need borrowed glory. Maybe he'll succeed. Maybe he'll fail. The furnace Walter placed him in will burn away whatever is false, and what remains will be honest metal or nothing at all. But the gift Walter gave him wasn't a second chance at a career. It was the opportunity to look his wife in the eye and say, "I was wrong, and I'm going to be better." That's a gift no golden parachute can buy. If you're watching this and you've ever been underestimated, laughed at, or dismissed for looking too small, take this story as a reminder. You're not small. The people who count are the ones who notice the quality of your work, not the price of your shoes. And if you've ever been the one holding up someone else's worn boot and mistaking it for weakness, this story is your invitation to pause before you assume you've already won. The quiet man across the table might own the whole boardroom. If this story stayed with you, hit that like button and subscribe. It's how more people find these stories, and it's what keeps the light on in this little corner of the internet. Drop a comment below. Tell me about a time you underestimated someone. or someone underestimated you. I read them. And to everyone who's been here from the start, thank you. You're the reason these stories keep being told. Real power doesn't announce itself. It walks in, sits down, and waits. And when it finally speaks, the whole room leans forward. Walter Whitlock knew that, and so did Martha the day she chose those boots. Walk through anything, she said. He did. And every step was solid,